Welcome back. We are Gentlemen United, and you are in the man cave. In our show tonight, I'll be speaking again to Andray Domise, who will help us to understand the basics about investing your hard-earned cash, saving and growing your money. As always, for those watching this broadcast live on YouTube, feel free to add your comments and questions in the comment bar. Returning to join us tonight is Gentlemen United member Andray Domise, and of course, you, our viewers. I'm Sean Best, and I'm your host and moderator. Andray, what's up, man? What's up?
Oh, not much, fam. How you doing?
Not bad, fam. All right, so let's get into this. I know we had two conversation topics we wanted to go over. The first one we've done already. It was on how to manage debt, how to understand it and manage it, and that was a great show, by the way. I learned stuff I didn't think I'd learned because I've been in financial services for a long time, so I figured it'd be a lot of stuff I'd already heard, but I heard some new stuff that I didn't know, so I really appreciate that show. I watched it a few times, by the way.
Hey, man, that's what I'm here for.
Good stuff. So this one is another one. It's on investing. So I know a lot of people don't think about saving money. They just think about spending the money that, you get that paycheck and think, all the extra spending money, I can go get those Jordans, I can go get those new rims, I can go get whatever. And investing's kind of like a boring topic, I think, to some people, but let's see if we can't spice it up a little bit.
For sure.
So I'm going to start off with this. There's a myth that says black people don't know how to manage their money. Now, in your experience, is that a black-white issue or is it a socioeconomic issue?
That's a historical issue. So the thing is, the funny part is if you look at black earning power and income throughout the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, there was how am I going to put it? We were able to accumulate money after the Great Migration. So I'm not sure if you know about the Great Migration, but in the post-war, like the post-Civil War period, up to right before World War I, and then again in the about 1919 through the early 1960s, what you saw, there was this massive, and it was the largest migration that had happened in North America. And it was this gigantic migration of black people out of the South and towards cities like Chicago and New York. That's how black people ended up getting into California. But there was a huge migration out of the South, and people pretty much carried what they could with them. And the reason was that they were trying to escape Jim Crow. And the reason that they migrated outwards was because they were being there was war and violence being brought upon them, not just in the physical sense, but also in the financial sense. So people who were able to, for example, buy property, people who were able to build careers as professionals, whether they were, wainwrights, millwrights, doctors, and so forth. When white neighbors saw that the black people who had been basically held under heel for centuries were starting to do better than they were, they didn't take very kindly to that, and they would destroy property, they would destroy storefronts, and they would threaten to lynch people. So people had to leave.
Are you referring to Black Wall Street in Oklahoma?
Well, that's so black people ended up in Oklahoma again in that post-Civil War period. So the people that ended up creating Black Wall Street were themselves migrants from the South. And then when just to describe what you're talking about with regards to Black Wall Street, that was in a suburb of Tulsa, Oklahoma, where again white neighbors saw that their black neighbors were doing much better than they were. And they rioted and burned the place down on the pretense that a black person had assaulted a white woman in an elevator. So whenever you see that black people do really well, and this is like all throughout the 20th century, there was always a backlash of white violence against them. So if you're asking, why is it that we're not able to save and build generational wealth and so forth? Well, a couple of things happen. One, you either have black people who are able to build that wealth, but then it's at risk of violence from their neighbors, or two, it's just straight up stolen from them. And Ta-Nehisi Coates very famously did an in-depth study on how black wealth was systemically plundered, robbed from them through these insane housing contracts, where, for example, you would sign on to buy a property, but you didn't really buy the property. You were just making payments on the property, and the person that you quote unquote bought it from actually ends up owning it. And until the last of these very, very high interest loans are paid off, that person has the right to kick you out of that home and then move somebody else in and then sort of flip them over into a new housing covenant. You had redlining, which meant that, around certain zip codes, Black people simply were not allowed to own property. You had blockbusting, i.e., if Black people moved into a certain neighborhood, white neighbors would band together to basically chase them out because they didn't want their property values falling.
Yeah.
So all of these things, like when you take all of these small components and then put them together and see the bigger picture, it's that Black people systemically have been disenfranchised and excluded from wealth building. And at the very same time, affirmative action was a white system in the post-war period. There's actually a really, really good book called When Affirmative Action Was White. I believe it was by Ira Katznelson. And he basically explained that the Great Deal, or the New Deal, in the post-World War II period, which was where, returning vets were able to pick up loans or go at a very low interest rate and be able to go to college at low to no tuition, which essentially created the middle class in America. Black people were essentially excluded from that. So at any time that we've actually done incredibly well for ourselves, we are kicked, like we take 2 steps forward and then 5 steps back.
So let me ask you a question on that, because in all those scenarios, that was the pre-information technology era.
Right.
And now that, businesses can be started up online, people can buy things online, you can invest online. All these things can be done in a virtual fashion, which to a certain degree creates a sense of anonymity. So whether you're Black or white or minority of any sort, unless you have a name that is obviously, Afrocentric, no one's really going to know who you are. Do you think that is something that is that will work in Black people's favor now? So,
sort of, kind of. I do believe that tech can be a force for equalization. The tech industry, however, I know people who, are around that venture capital crowd, and again, you have venture capitalists that are sinking tens of millions of dollars into tech ventures, and essentially giving it to frat boys and college dropouts. Tend to be white guys for the most part, that will just like completely blow through and squander savings, or squander the capital that was invested. But in order for Black people to receive venture capital, it goes back to that old saying, and we used to talk about this in the corporate world, whereas corporate managers, when they're looking at white men job applicants, they look for potential, but in everybody else, they look for proof. And venture capitalists have carried this mentality over to which tech operations are going to fund. So it would be great if everybody was able to start from the same place, create an app or have an idea for a tech innovation, and then simply push it forward. But unfortunately, that does require capital. And that capital, for the most part, is concentrated into the hands of a very few people in one particular geographic region. And unfortunately, they tend to direct all of their hard-earned dollars towards white bros that end up wasting all of their money. And meanwhile, the rest of us who would like to get in on this market are excluded.
So one of the I think opportunities here that so I live in the Atlanta area, and Atlanta is there's a lot of venture capitalist activity here. There are a lot of angel investors here. There's a lot of new tech coming out of Atlanta. I believe Georgia Tech produces a lot of grads who come up with these fantastic new ideas, these new apps, these new technology. So there's lots of investment money flowing down here. But how about the use of? I know we're going to get into investments, but this kind of is leading in that direction. We're talking about sort of being able to grow wealth, and part of it is more than just sticking money into a retirement investment. It's about being able to build your own wealth on your own blood, sweat, and tears. So how about services like Kickstarter, where you can crowdfund?
I got bad news for you on that investment front, but let's repeat your question now on Kickstarter. Yeah.
So how about, to your point, if investment money is coming from a very small group of people, and the access for people who are minorities to those funds can be limited, severely limited, which of course stifles creativity and stifles growth and stifles wealth throughout generation. how about crowdfunding services like Kickstarter and other crowdfunding sites? Isn't that sort of an opportunity for somebody who can reach out to their own community and say, hey, look, I know you can't afford to loan me $1 million, but could you loan me 20?
Yeah, possibly, except that Kickstarters are so common, and not just Kickstarters, but crowdfunding ventures are so common that essentially we're running into an age of crowdfunding fatigue. And unless your idea is really, really, really good, that can stand out above the others in an incredibly crowded market, it's hard. Like, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that somebody who has a really good idea look towards Kickstarter first. Kickstarter is actually somewhere where that's more of like an end goal. So if you're able to raise capital on your own or through your network or people that you're able to link up with, and then show in your Kickstarter that you've already raised X amount of thousands of dollars, whether it's tens or hundreds of thousands, but you want to show in your Kickstarter that you've already been able to raise some money and you just need some more to get across that finish line. So I really wish that it was as easy as all that. And I know that where it comes to establishing business and creating capital, we're inside of the Black community, it is a tough game. I'm just going to come out and say it. I think there's a lot of Black people that have aversion to doing business with other Black people. And
we had that show up about a month and a half ago. Yes.
Yeah. So it's unfortunate, but I have seen it time and time again. There's this sort of trepidation. And I think we've in some ways learned what white supremacy has taught us and internalized that. So we will very casually and glibly go out and do business with white people and entrust them with our dollars. But when it comes to within our own community, you're always looking for, okay, well, what's this brother's ankle, or what is it? I need to look. Yeah, exactly. I need to look a little bit deeper. And then unfortunately, there are some people that have taken the community for a ride. I don't know if you remember, Russell Simmons had that, what was it? The Rush dollars. Essentially, he had like a, for people that aren't able to get bank accounts at traditional banks, they had like sort of an electronic savings, and they basically had to go online and apply for this card. And once you got the card, you could have let's say if you work at, Walmart or Burger King or wherever, you could have your direct deposit made to that account through the card that you got online through Russell Simmons's program. And unfortunately, I'm not sure how this could have possibly happened, but the company ended up literally losing people's savings. Like some sort of glitch happened. They lost people's savings, and people have rent to pay, they've got bills and so forth, and they didn't get this money back to them for weeks, some of them months. So your account has gone down to zero, whereas you had like hundreds or if not thousands of dollars in the account, and all of a sudden now you've got no money whatsoever. And dude didn't put out a statement for a couple of weeks about this, and then had these really sort of like, I'm very sorry about these kind of tweets, when it's like, dude, you need to run people their money. So getting back to the point, just unfortunately, there's a few examples where you see people in the community taking advantage of, the kindness and I don't want to say generosity, but sort of like the camaraderie that we all try to band together and support each other. And some people very casually take advantage of that. And I think that sort of plays into why it's hard for us to support our own businesses.
Well, here's the thing, too. You're going to find people like that in every community, every color, every size, every shape, every nationality. There's just people who are sociopaths who don't really have any empathy. They don't really care. They'll rob you blind. They're running a new scam. But it's kind of a shame that you have one person that sours the milk for other people who see an opportunity, like, people like yourself and myself, other professionals who, they may see a young person like, coming right out of University of Toronto or Georgia Tech or wherever, who has a great idea and say, what, this young man looks like he has his head on his shoulders. I know a few other people, we don't have millions of dollars, but we can probably invest a few $1,000s between us and help this young man out. I think there's still opportunity in our community to do that. That's my perspective. Because our community now, it can be spread globally through the advent of technology. It isn't necessarily, having a community who is within arm's reach, but having a community who is within reach of your concept and your idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the quickest ways to go about that, to establish your credibility, is like if your online persona, if you're on social media and you're talking up your product and what it is that you're doing, and you as a person, like I hate using the word brand because I don't think that people like I'm really not a fan of this late capitalist model of taking like corporate jargon and then trying to apply it to people. But people talk about their personal brand. I just say like, who you are in this world, your personality. And if who you are in this world on your social media, like you're talking about the things that other people are talking about and you're progressive and you're trying to move things forward, I think that goes a long way in helping people make the decision to support you. So I'm not saying there's no opportunities out there. I am saying though that it does make it more difficult. And we've had so many instances of just being taken advantage of, if not disenfranchised or violated, by a white supremacist system, by banks that were entirely predatory, by mortgage lenders and real estate agents that took complete advantage of people. So it's hard enough when you've had that violence visited upon you economically under a white supremacist system. And then on top of that, when it happens from your own people, it's just, I can understand why people are gun shy on this. But at the same time, I think things are actually getting better.
Yeah, and I think to your point, what you were talking about before was really being able to engender a sense of trust. So if you're on social media like we are right now, and people get to hear the way you speak and the way you think and the way you reason and see the passion that you have for your idea, the fact that you've thought it through, you've looked at the different angles, you've done your business plan. I think obviously it's part of the presentation, right? If you were presenting in front of potential investors, I've done it myself before. They have to buy into you as a person. In addition to your idea, they need to know that you have passion for your idea. You're not just in it to make a few dollars, because that usually doesn't lead anywhere.
Right.
So let's get on to some very specific investment type questions. What are some of the most common questions you get from your clients about investing? People who walk in the front door don't know the first thing about investing other than how to find the dictionary under eye.
Common questions first of all, when I was a financial planner, nobody walked in the door. I had to go out and do a lot of networking and really put myself out there so that people knew that that's what I do. I would say that the most common question people have was addressed in our last episode, what is good debt from bad debt and how do I get rid of these credit cards and so forth. I liken, financial planning to dentistry. Like that's to me like the closest industry, because for dentists, you have your occasional person, like your 20% of people. They're going to come in on a regular basis, make sure they get their teeth clean, get their x-rays and everything else, make sure that their grill's in perfect condition.
I did that today.
Exactly. So you're one of the 20%.
Yeah.
But the Pareto rule holds true. 80% is just going to be a mess. And, for dentists, they're going to have that 80% of people that will not attend their regular checkups, not take care of themselves. And then they show up when they're in such pain that they have to, let's say, get a root canal or have a tooth removed and so on. And that's the same thing with financial planning, is that you'll have 20% of people that are on the ball that will, take care of their finances and just need you to give, a helping hand or give some guidance. And then you have 80% of people who they don't come to you until they're in a lot of pain. So that was me mostly unwinding the debt situation. But on the investing side, everyone has ideas as to how it is that they're going to get rich. There was a saying I heard a while back, and I forget who said it. I believe it was Chris Hedges, but I might be wrong on this, which is that, the problem with Americans is that everyone believes that they're a temporarily embarrassed millionaire. So when it came to investing, that's the mentality that I ran into, is that everyone thought that they were going to make some money on XYZ stock, or, they're asking me questions about covered calls and hedge funds, asking me questions about shorting stock. And this was miles and miles ahead of where they were. If you've got $70,000 in credit card debt, you've got no savings to your name whatsoever, and all the money that you're earning from your daytime job is just being eaten up servicing that debt. You don't need to be talking about covered calls or hedge funds or anything like that. And as a matter of fact, us even talking about mutual funds is probably 3 steps ahead of where you are right now anyway.
I was going to get to mutual funds in a moment, actually, just to talk about what they actually are, but hang on to that for just a moment. So,
Sure.
Another question for the I know that you're very well versed in financial matters, but for the average person who doesn't know anything about that, how early should you start saving and investing? How early should you start?
I'm gonna put it. I don't think that the average person needs to do a heck of a lot of saving until they're in their late 20s and early 30s. As a matter of fact, like I know that in the financial industry, we want people to start saving as soon as possible, but the fact of the matter is, the more money that you're putting in the bank or you're investing, the more money that they're making. I do think that you need a period of your life where you need to not worry about that. Just do the stuff that you really enjoy and then get to it when it's necessary. So I think that people talk about saving in their teens and so forth. I am not necessarily in agreement with that. I think that if you can discipline your spending enough that you're able to save, that 10% and put it away for the future, absolutely go ahead. It's just that that's not where most people are. And I think we've gotten into this really sort of punitive way of thinking where if somebody isn't saving 10% of their income, even though they need 100% of their income just to cover their living expenses, and the living expenses for, I think, most people are fairly reasonable. There was an author, his name is Chris Bach, and he wrote this book David Bach, and he wrote this book called The Automatic Millionaire. And The Automatic Millionaire, he described a concept called the latte factor. And the latte factor was a phrase that he came up with when a client of his came in and he was going over her monthly expenses. And he saw that she was ordering her latte at Starbucks on a daily basis. And he was saying, listen, like, you'd be able to save some of the money that you are looking for to be able to put away for the long term. You'd be able to save some of that by just cutting down the amount of lattes that you're buying.
Just make it a home.
Yeah, exactly. So, make your coffee at home, and then you're saving like an extra like $5 a day or $7 a day or whatever. And you can put that towards your savings, which is a reasonable ask. But I think what people have turned that into now is that everybody has a latte factor. Like there's some area in your life where you could be spending less money, but because you have no discipline whatsoever, this is why you're broke. So they'll say like, oh, I noticed that you have a new iPhone, or I noticed that you have like cable TV or a big screen TV, or this is my favorite, a flat screen TV, as if there's any other kind of TV that you could buy.
Anymore, right? You can't find any other.
When people talk about iPhones and flat screen TVs as though that is not the default option. So everyone seems to believe that everyone else is irresponsible with their money. And I try to stay away from that as much as possible. And as a matter of fact, like, if you're down to the point where your living expenses, like your rent, your food, your transportation, like you're taking the bus places, all of that is like eating up the majority of your income, and you've barely got anything left over at the end of the month. Like, I'm not gonna come down on you for buying a latte. That might be the only thing that's like,
that keeps you going.
Yeah. Keeping you from just like going out and swinging on people. You know what I mean? Like if that's what's keeping you going, like have that. Your mental health and your psychological health is also important. And I think that people get into this mentality where if you're not like making yourself as efficient as like some imaginary private corporation that spends every dollar efficiently and is able to save up and makes really good investments, like everyone thinks that they're, a Warren Buffett in the making. And unfortunately, that's just not true.
Right.
So getting back to this point, how early should you start saving? As early as you can without hurting yourself.
Right. So one of the bits of advice I once heard somebody say was, when you look at your income, you, of course, put aside the income that you need to pay your living expenses, your bills, and so on. And then what you have left is considered, of course, disposable income. You take a portion of the disposable income, you put that away, some sort of investment, and the rest of it is money that you enjoy, so that you can enjoy your latte. So I think what you're basically saying is, you don't want to pay your bills and take what's left and put it in investment, because you'll be miserable. And what I found happens, I've seen it happen before, is people go through a period of 6, 7, 8, 9 months where they're just they're eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, they're taking the bus, they're taking 3 transfers and from one bus to the next. And they get to a point after 9 months where they've had enough, and they go out and buy an expensive race car with the money they just saved, and they're back to zero again. So,
right.
Right.
But that's what it is, and it's almost the same as like dieting. You know, the world is not set up for you to diet. The world is not created in such a way that, you know, being healthy and having a lean muscular physique, the world just isn't built that way for you to have that option.
Well,
What
you
happens
need
is
to
the
talk to
world-
Sean Mitchell from my show last week.
But it's true. I mean, you go into a grocery store, you know, and you are from the entrance to the exit just bombarded with all of these unhealthy food options. And right before you leave, you know, there's the checkout counter that's got like racks upon racks upon racks of, you know, unhealthy foods. And even if you've been resisting the temptation all along the way, it can literally, like, your willpower is not like a fort. Your willpower is a muscle, and it can get exhausted. You know, by the time you reach the end of that checkout counter, your willpower can break. And it's the same thing where it comes to saving. You keep on denying yourself these small pleasures, and at some point you're just like, you know what, screw it, I deserve this.
Yes,
You know,
yeah, I like that analogy. It's like a muscle.
Yeah, it is. It really is. So I think that, you know, if you look at if you are able to, if you're fortunate enough to get yourself in a situation where your living expenses is taking up 50% or less of your income, and then you're able to take an extra, maybe say 10%, and put that towards and not just 10% for like long-term savings, but 10% and then 10% and then another 10%. So 10% to be able to put that towards your long-term savings, 10% for your liquid cash, and then 10% for your fund investments. If you're fortunate enough to get yourself into a situation like that, then absolutely do it. And then the remainder, spend it however the hell you want. Like, that's what I usually will recommend, so that at least you know that you're covering your expenses. You've got some savings happening for the long term, and then you've got some fun money. Or what I also ask people to do is flip it on its head. Rather than 10% for your long-term savings, take 10% and put that for whatever you want to spend it on. So if you save, let's say, 10% over the course of a year, by the time Christmas comes around, you can splurge on gifts, or you can take a nice little vacation. But just try to flip that paradigm on its head, so that you are putting money away for something that just is really meaningful and fun to you. Whereas I find that in the financial world, we try to tell people to completely deny themselves any happiness or joy whatsoever. And we put a virtue on these newspaper stories that pop up every so often, where, you know, some guy lived in his parents' basement and worked 2 jobs while he was in university and was able to pay his debts off in 2 years and then buy a home like the year after he got his first job out of university. It's like, oh, congratulations, hey, this guy's really good. But it's like, yeah, not everyone has that option. Not everyone has that kind of life and that support system. So I try to stay away from glorifying that.
So I like the way, let me see if I can restate or just summarize what you just said, because I liked the idea. So like this here, this is like a pie. You have a pie, and the pie represents all of your money, all of your income. And there's a chunk of that pie that goes out to all your bills and your expenses. And what's left, then you break it into, I think it turns out to be,
like, if you can,
the four parts. So you have 10% to invest for long term, 10% for
three parts. So 10% for your long-term savings, and we'll get into the talk about mutual funds and so forth.
Yeah, it's next.
10% for your long-term savings, 10% for your liquid cash.
And liquid cash means, you know, in case you blow out a tire or something happens, it's emergency money.
Exactly. Okay. Right, exactly. And then 10% for speculative investing. So if you're the kind of person that really wants to go, like, try out day trading and see how that works, or if you want to set yourself up with a Questrade or a Scotia iTrade account, I guess down in the States, do you guys still have E-Trade?
I don't know, maybe.
Okay. I'm from Canada, so I'm not 100% familiar with U.S. systems, but I'm pretty sure you guys have Questrade down there. But some people will take, 10% of their funds and then put it towards, like, just playing the market and seeing how they're able to, and then I've had people, like, send me back their awesome trades and be like, hey, dude, did you see this? Like, your mutual fund is not performing that much. Which, if it brings people joy, then absolutely. If it brings you some money, all the better. So if you can get it to a point where 30% of your income is going towards just some sort of long-term cash strategy, and then the remaining 20% you can just spend on whatever the heck you want, that's the best situation to be in.
Yeah. In fact, so that example that you used, where the last little bit you can use for, like, day trading, whatever, for the average person who knows nothing about that, doesn't want to risk that, you could perhaps use that 10% for, to your point, your vacation fund or your Christmas fund or whatever. Saving it for some modifications on your new car. You want to put some, new exhaust system on it, some flow
That's
masters.
the thing. Like whatever it is that you really want to be able to do, whether it's taking vacations, whether it's, I don't know, salsa classes, whatever it is that really would make you happy, I think 10% of your income should be going towards that
Right.
at a minimum. 20% would be great, but 10% is
Realistic.
a good place to start. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so on to the question we keep touching on. What is a mutual fund and why are there so many types? Like, I know what mutual funds are, but explain to us what a mutual fund is.
Okay, I think a better place to start from is what stocks and bonds are.
Okay.
Because mutual funds are basically just bundles of them. So
Right.
the great Mongol warrior Genghis Khan once showed a single arrow to his sons and then showed a bundle of arrows. And he was able to break the single arrow and say, you see how I can break this arrow? And then he held up a bundle of arrows and tried to break it and he couldn't. And he showed them that, because he wanted his sons to be unified rather than squabbling with each other about his inheritance. I say all this to say that that's kind of how a mutual fund works, is that you're bundling together investments of some kind. And, if you put all your eggs in one basket and buy a single stock, then your financial fortunes are tied to the fortunes of that company. So if that company tanks, well, then so does your investment. But if you are able to diversify by buying into a mutual fund, that fund, let's say in Canada, for example, right? The Canadian Dividend Fund would be made of the large banks and the large natural resources companies in Canada. So a Canadian Dividend Fund, for example, might own like Manulife or Sun Life Financial, TD Canada Trust, RBC, CIBC. You might get some very large natural resources companies in there as well. But the whole point is for you to buy into several different, very large and very strong, what we call blue chip companies. In the United States, to be quite honest, I don't know what would be in a fund purchased in the US, but if you were to buy a US based fund in Canada, you might find a Google in there, you might find Apple in there, you might find some of the larger financial companies, i.e. Chase, Bank of America in there.
So just to reframe this for people to understand. So instead of taking my money and investing in the stock of ABC company, what I can do with the mutual fund is I can invest in your money and buying
it. Yeah, instead of taking your money and buying Apple stock, you might create some safety for yourself by buying a mutual fund that owns Apple inside of that fund, but then also invests in maybe some of Apple's competitors. Might also invest in Samsung. If you are bullish on U.S. banks, then you might buy a fund that owns Chase, but you can also own Bank of America. You can own several different banks within that mutual fund. So basically the fund is creating a portfolio for you in a way. So there's a manager of the fund and the manager makes the buying and selling decisions on your behalf. Now, getting back to the stock and bond situation, bonds were in the late 1970s and the early to mid 1980s, bonds were huge. As a matter of fact, there was a collapse in the bond market because bond yields were way higher than they would normally be. So here's the thing about a bond. A bond is essentially like a promise to pay for the future, right? So if you, for example, Sean, were to lend me $100 and say, hey, listen, man, you don't have to get me back like right now. You can get me back 5 years from now. You're taking $100 out of your pocket to do that. So there's an opportunity cost to you, right? Now, what you might do in order to recoup that cost is to say, okay, well, you don't have to get me back until 5 years from now. But in the meantime, I need you to start paying me on a regular schedule. Let's call it, I don't know, $5 a year over that 5 years. And then at the end of it, you can return me back my $100. Does that sound fair?
Sure.
So that's essentially what a bond is. The $100 that you loaned me, that's what's called the face value of the bond. So for, if I was to put this to you, Sean, what would be the face value of a $100 bill?
$100.
Yeah, exactly. It's got 100 right there on the front, $100. But $100 with what's called a coupon value, that 5 up in the upper right-hand corner, that's the $5 a year that you expected from me to pay you back until I pay you back the $100 original principal, right? Mm-hmm. So the coupon value of that bond is basically what's going to be paying out to the investor over the course of X amount of years until the bond matures. That is the end of that 5-year period. So when you buy a bond, you're essentially loaning the money to a company or an entity that's paying you a certain amount of money, that is the coupon value, until such time the bond matures and you receive your money back. Now, if you want, you can say, well, hang on, it's all good. I don't need the money back yet. I can just go ahead and like purchase back another bond.
Reinvest it, right.
Yeah, exactly. Now, here's the other thing. Let's say you need your $100 back, but I'm not good for it until 5 years from now. What you can do then is sell your bond to somebody else, right? Sell the debt that I owe you to somebody else, and I end up paying them instead, and you get your $100 back. Make sense?
Yep, it does. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
But what if at the time that you want to sell my debt to you, that $100 debt, the cost of living has gone up. So, inflation has gone up, and the $5 that I owed you before, well, that's not really cutting it because the cost of gas has gone up quite a bit. And for you to make ends meet, I really need to be paying you more like, I don't know, $7 a year. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So your friend who agrees to buy your $100 debt that I owe you could, if he wants to loan $100 to somebody else at that time, because the cost of living has gone up, inflation has gone up, the going value for a $100 loan is actually $7 at that point. So
right.
If you want to sell him this $100 loan that I owe you, and I'm paying you back $5, but he could do the same with somebody else and get back $7.
Right.
Okay, so then what is the value of my debt to you now? Is it higher or lower?
I have no idea.
Well, it's probably lower because he could get $7 by loaning $100 to somebody else, right?
Okay.
Rather than getting the $5 I owe him, he could do the same thing and get $7 elsewhere.
Right.
So the concept I'm trying to explain to you is that when interest rates go up, then coupon or bond values go down.
Okay.
So he might say, yeah, sure. You know what, Sean? It's good. I got you. I will buy that bond from you. I'll buy Andre's debt from you, but I'm only going to pay you $75 for it. But you need the money now. So you're like, sure, whatever.
Yeah, I'll eat $25.
Yeah, I'll eat the 25 so I can get my $100 back right away.
Yeah. Or
and
75.
that's how, exactly. And that's how rising interest rates can affect bonds. So a rising interest rate will then push down the value of a bond at X coupon value.
Okay. And there are all kinds of bonds. It does. So, and there's all kinds of bonds. There's government bonds. There's municipal bonds. There's state. There's all sorts of bonds somebody could.
Right, and there's corporate bonds out there as well. It's always a smart proposition to save money for the long term. You're not going to find anybody who purports to call themselves a financial advisor that's going to tell you not to put money aside for the long term. It's really more a matter of what works in your budget to be able to put away, and where are the best places to invest. So as I mentioned last week, I would often run into people who would ask me questions about like derivatives and covered calls and hedge funds and that kind of stuff. And it's like, if you're not on the hedge fund level, don't really try to get there. Like if you're not already there, don't worry about that for the time being. Really just focus on getting yourself set up for the long term. So I find that a lot of the interest in the more complicated financial products comes out of a desire to get rich quick. And you really just want to stick with the simple stuff. So if you're the average Canadian or American worker that has the option for a group RSP, a group defined contribution pension plan, or in the States, if you have the option for a group 401k, then yeah, absolutely go ahead and take that. If Workplace is offering you an IRA, for example, like go after that and buy the cheapest funds. So last time we were getting into, we were talking about bonds and how those work. We hadn't really gotten all the way into mutual funds. But essentially what a mutual fund is it's a collection of securities. So we talked about bonds last time. The relationship that bonds have to the interest rate is inverse. The higher the interest rate goes, the lower your bond value becomes. But if you have a stock, then the interest rates and a whole whack of other factors come into play to give you the valuation of your stock. If you buy a single stock, if you buy one single security, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. You're buying into one company. So, for example, if you bought Apple stock, if you bought Google stock, if you bought Chase stock, or if you bought TD stock or RBC stock, you're placing your fortunes into the hands of one company. Whereas buying a fund spreads out your risk by buying into many different companies, probably at a cheaper rate than you'd be able to buy into yourself. So when you buy a mutual fund, essentially the fund manager is buying and selling those investments on your behalf, hopefully over the long term to make you some money. So when you get into your group 401k or you get into your pension plan at work or your group RSP, what essentially happens is you buy from a menu of funds that your workplace offers you. And it's up to you to decide how comfortable you are with the risk offered by those funds. If you buy a fund that is based on bonds, probably not going to be very risky, probably going to get you a lower rate of return over the long term, but it's going to be consistent. Versus, let's say, if you get into like a Canadian large cap mutual fund or an American large cap mutual fund, the word large cap meaning large capitalization, the largest companies available. They're also called blue chips. Your risk is not very high. You're buying into very large and well-established companies, but there's always a risk of loss, and that's going to happen from time to time. The market is cyclical. There's ups and there's downs, so you have to be prepared for that. And then beyond that, there's some of the more, I would say, some people might call it risky, some people might call it more volatile, but investments that come out of specific sectors. So you might have, natural resources mutual funds that invest in, let's say, oil, gas, natural energy stocks. You might have tech mutual funds that invest in, obviously, tech companies. You might have overseas funds that invest in countries like Brazil and Russia, India, and China. So it's really up to you to determine what your level of risk is and how much you're willing to invest in each. I usually say, keep the bulk of your investments in something stable, secure, those bond-based funds. If you're a moderate type of risk investor, you probably want to stick around 40% of your mutual fund portfolio into those bond-based funds, 60% into those equity-based funds, that is where you buy into companies, and keep the majority of that into large and well-established companies, if that all makes sense to you.
Yeah, no, it does for me because I've invested in mutual funds for many, many, many years. But basically, I think the message you're giving is if you invest in one stock, your fortunes rise and fall with that one company. But a mutual fund spreads it doesn't put all of your eggs in one basket. So it spreads the risk a little thinner, and still, if an industry tends to move up or down, and those companies are all within the same industry, you may still experience a little bit of uncertainty. But if you spread it thinly enough or across a number of different securities, you theoretically will weather the storm as far as the cycles go. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's the whole idea, is that you want to put together a portfolio that's going to last you over the long term. What a lot of people do is buy what are called index funds, which are almost like set it and forget it. Here's the thing. Index funds track a particular stock index. So for example, the index fund for Canada would be the TSX. Index fund for the United States tends to be the S&P 500. So buying index funds over the long term, because it mirrors exactly what's on that stock index. The index funds tend to outperform directly managed portfolios in the majority of years. So for the most part, paying additional amounts, like paying a higher amount of fund fees for those managed funds, where you've got a manager that's trying to beat the market, in most cases, it's a dud.
I'm sorry. Say that again, because you cut out for a minute. So you're saying, in most cases, index funds are a dud?
No. In most cases, managed funds, and maybe dud is the wrong word, because then I'm going to have a lot of financial advisors mad at me. But the fact of the matter is, in most years, index funds are going to beat out managed funds. So a fund where somebody's sitting there actively buying and selling stock on your behalf and trying to beat the market, versus buying into a fund that mirrors what the market looks like, that benchmark usually will beat most fund managers in the majority of years. So if you're trying to get the best bang for your buck, index funds tend to be cheaper. They have lower fees. And unfortunately, these managed funds don't do often as well as promised. People buy into condos at the ground level, like before ground has even been broken, and companies have gone bankrupt, even though the condos were almost fully sold before um, before the construction began. That's an unfortunate byproduct of the hot real estate market. I'm loath to call it a bubble because a bubble implies that it's overvalued, that there's no value to be found, and it's all speculation. Now, granted, a large portion of what we're seeing in the real estate market in Canada is speculation. I mean, all real estate, if you really want to think about it, is speculation. All investments are speculation. But there's an actual value to the real estate. If you build a condo in, let's say, Etobicoke, Ontario, it's going to have value. People are going to move into it. They're going to be close by to the GO station. They're going to go to work. That property actually does have a value. It's just a matter of what value do we place on it and who can actually afford to live inside the city. And unfortunately, that's just until the government steps in to cool down the market by imposing more restrictions, whether it be on how many units you're allowed to sell before you've actually begun construction, whether it's a matter of trying to increase the property transfer taxes, whether it's increasing the limits and tightening the regulations on foreign home buyers. And I don't want to point towards foreign home buyers as the source of this problem. It's just that there's a multitude of problems that require a multitude of solutions. But unfortunately, some of the byproducts you see are that people, and this has happened not just in Etobicoke, but it's happened other times in Toronto, where people buy into a condo that's being built, and then the builder goes bankrupt before the building is complete, or sometimes even before the building has broken ground. Someone has to step in, buy that project up from the company that's now in receivership. Basically, everybody who bought into the property gets the money back, but nothing else. And they can't afford to buy into the home that they thought they were going to own, because the new company that's now stepped in and snapped up this receivership is now going to jack up the prices that they ask per unit. So it's sad, but it is what it is. There's not really a lot that we can do about that. Unfortunately, this is a side effect of a massive amount of people retiring with a massive amount of wealth all at the same time, and being unwilling to part with that wealth, and occupying neighborhoods that were at some points low income neighborhoods, occupying neighborhoods that were at some points, for the majority of them, were for young families. But you have people that are retiring into their 1-story bungalows, but the value on them is just so insanely high that nobody can afford to buy into those neighborhoods now.
Okay.
Back around the 1950s and 60s, when pension plans were coming on vogue in the post-war economy, it was, I wouldn't say easy, but it was relatively easier for a fund manager to be able to underpin the return on a pension plan by buying long-term bonds that had a fairly high interest rate. We talked about interest rates before. One other thing about interest rates is that, over the long term, the longer your bond goes, the more unstable the value when it is. Towards the end of the 60s, the 70s, and into the early 80s, before the bond market collapsed, what fund managers were able to do was get incredibly high returns and consistent returns on those funds that underpinned the pension. So you had sort of a floor, like a basis for the pensions that was composed of bonds. And then the fund managers would also buy securities on top of that. They'd make some long-term speculations. They'd make some real estate buys. They'd get into markets that you and I wouldn't normally be able to get into. But the ultimate reality for those pensions, from the 50s through the 80s, was that it wasn't unreasonable for a pension to be returning 10 and 12 and 14% year over year over the long term. So because of that perpetual growth on those bonds, then you're able to say to employees when they join the pension plan, listen, you pay into this pension plan over the course of, say, 30 years or 35 years or 40 years. By the time you're ready to retire, we'll be able to give you $50,000 a year consistently until the time you die, or if you wanted to put your spouse on that as well, 50,000 paid out to you, and then if you pass away, then she receives the remainder of the pension until she passes away, and then your pension is wrapped up at that point. That was fairly easy for pension managers to do up to about the 90s. What we've seen in the last about 20 years is that the bond market that underpinned those pension plans has slowly become unraveled. And it's difficult for bonds to yield even like a 6% rate of return, which 20 years ago was rather conservative, but now it's a pretty aggressive bond fund. So because bonds are yielding so much less, and because fund managers have to keep on chasing more and more speculative investments just to keep up with the same rates of return that they were getting, say 20, 25 years ago, unfortunately, we're coming to a point now where that they call them golden parachutes. The pension plan that gives you a guarantee as to how much money you're going to get when you retire, those are starting to fall out of favor. So anytime that you see that there is a union that's into collective bargaining and you hear anything about the pension plan, that's usually what 90% of these fights are about, is whether or not they're going to be able to keep these pension plans that guarantees the income after retirement. It's just so expensive right now to give a guaranteed wage to somebody who's retiring, given that the market itself is a lot shakier now than it used to be, given that returns are harder to come by now than they used to be. You're seeing now, companies and organizations, whether it's the government, Canada just went through this. We had a huge brouhaha with Canada Post, our mail carrier, as to whether new employees were going to be able to qualify for that gold-plated pension plan. The same thing happens with teachers. The same thing happens with auto workers. The same thing is going to happen in just about any union, whether it's public or private sector. So just to get back to the point of your question, whether it's worth it to get involved in one of these plans, it's always going to be worth it. The question is, what kind of plan are you going to be able to get? If you're entering the workforce now, good luck. You're probably not going to be part of any of those plans. The vast majority of private plans are now what are called defined contribution, where you know how much you're putting in, but you have no idea how much you're going to get out, versus defined benefit, which is you know exactly how much you're going to be getting in the end. You have a guaranteed income. Defined benefit in the private sector is almost non-existent at this point. Defined benefit in the public sector still exists, but there are more public sector bureaucracies that are trying to get rid of these old gold-plated pension plans because, frankly, employers can't afford to pay for them anymore. You know what some of these startup companies are doing now, these jerks? It's become a common jerk move in the tech sector to fire an employee before the stock options vest.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it happen recently.
Pardon me?
I've seen it happen recently.
Yeah, so vesting means the point at which the investment that you got through your group plan belongs to you. So, for example, if you have options for a company that you just joined and the options vest after 2 years, it means that the stock is purchased and it's in your name. And after 2 years, it then transfers over like you own that stock. Vesting is when it actually belongs to you. So you can sell it if you want to. You can keep it. You can do whatever you want with it. It then belongs to you. So what a lot of these companies are doing is luring people in with the promise of stock options and then canning them before their options vest, meaning that they leave with nothing. It's sad, and what you're seeing a lot more of is it's like corporate cannibalism. They try to cut costs by basically eating into the benefits that they already promised their employees, and it's a terrible way to do business. But I think it's all part and parcel with the idea that the pension promise, that was made to people in the post-war economy, the post-World War II economy, we're not able to keep up with those promises anymore, and that's the reality that we have to face. Right. We're not going to be able to take care of everyone into retirement. Unfortunately, it's increasingly becoming an every man and woman and otherwise for themselves. Like in the United States, it's called Social Security. In Canada, it's called the Canada Pension Plan, which is basically how much money that you receive after the age of 65 as a government-sponsored long-term pension plan. The thing about Social Security and the CPP is that it's actually fully funded. So the baby boomers did have fewer children than their parents had, You know, in the post-war economy, it wasn't uncommon to have 3, 4, 5 children, and then baby boomers were themselves having only, say, 1 or 2. But we've had massive population growth since then. Like the population of Canada and the United States hasn't remained static in the last 60 years. It's actually exploded. And that's partially because there's been a massive wave of immigration. So whereas, you know, the boomers did have fewer children, there were enough people who were immigrating into the country and then bolstering those pension plans, both Social Security and the Canada Pension Plan, by their own contributions into the workplace. So both of them are actually fully funded. This idea that, you know, CPP and Social Security are not going to exist by the time that maybe you and I retire, that's not true. It's funded well enough that we should be okay. The issue there is whether the private pension plans that you get for, you know, going to work every day, the plans that your employer funds for you, whether or not those are viable. And the defined benefit pension plans, the ones where you know how much you're going to get, what we know is that for the most part, they're no longer viable. They won't continue to be viable because there aren't enough people contributing into those plans to make them that way. And they're also becoming much more difficult to manage to be able to achieve the kind of growth that they have to achieve to cover all their employees when they do retire. So that's why everyone's switching over to what are called defined contribution pension plans, which is, as I described before, where you get a menu of investments when you join a company, and they say, okay, after your probation period is over, you can buy some investments from this company. Usually the fund management fees, if you buy like your own mutual fund, in Canada, we actually have the highest mutual fund fees in the developed world. The average in Europe, you're looking at around 1.5% management fee, meaning that if you invest $100,000, 1.5% of that, $1,500 is going to be taken out year to year to cover the fund management fees, how much they're going to pay the manager, the administration fees, and so forth. In the United States, the fund management fees are on average around 1%. But in Canada, you want to take a crack at how much we're paying for fund management fees?
2%? Average
of 2.5%.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's we pay like outlandish fund management fees, and the problem is that by the time if you hold a mutual fund in Canada, I believe it's on average for about 50 years. By the time 50 years is up, because of the fund management fees, it's actually at 2%. 2/3 of your original capital will have been eaten up by the fees.
It's almost not. Well, so it's not worth it, basically.
Yeah, well, that's the problem. But if you have a workplace pension plan where the fund management fees might drop, below 1%, some of them can be as low as like 10 basis points, 0.1%. Then of course, like you would absolutely want to be in that. Obviously, the more people who are participating in the plan, the higher they're able to discount those fund management fees, because the sheer volume of the people investing, the fund manager is going to get rich regardless. So they're able to heavily discount those fees. So if you do have the option in the workplace of buying those defined contribution funds, absolutely take it, because it's going to be way, way cheaper doing it through your workplace than going to the bank and doing it.
Listening to all this, it makes me think that the best thing you can do with your money is when you get your paycheck, you cash it out, you put it in a safety deposit box, and you stick it in the bank. That's probably the only way no one's going to get at and start picking away at your money. Is that a ridiculous thing to say?
Well, maybe there's not a person that's going to stick their hand in your pocket and try to take out money in terms of fees, but there's always inflation. And unfortunately, it's a fact of life that we can't get away from. I happened to stop at Tim Hortons on the way home, and I know for a fact that the muffin I paid for today, costs way more than a muffin that I would have bought 5 years ago, and probably 3 times as much as the muffin that I would have gotten, say, 10 years ago. So inflation is an unfortunate fact of life. So simply putting your funds into, like a savings account where nobody can get their hands on it, sure. But how much is that money going to be worth when you take it out in, say, 5, 10, or 20 years?
About the same as if it was in a mutual fund after you pay all your management fees.
No, I mean, your average, if your mutual funds are performing well, then you should see an average of about 8% rate of return year over year. Over, let's say, a 10-year span, getting 6, 7, or 8% rate of return on your mutual funds is not unheard of. It's not super aggressive. Whereas, putting your funds into a savings account, you might be lucky to get 1.5% out of that on a year-to-year basis.
Yeah. I do have some friends of mine who have also looked at, okay, the value of the dollar goes up and down, interest rates go up and down. People who are concerned about particularly the U.S. dollar, and the myth that there's nothing backing the U.S. dollar other than just, I guess, hearsay.
People would like to go back to the gold standard. Unfortunately, I don't really understand what value gold has. For the most part, the majority of gold gets dug up out of the ground and then moved somewhere and then put back in the ground again. So the idea of going back on the gold standard, my question is why? What value does gold have exactly? You say that you're pegging your money to something that's tangible. Okay, well then why not tag it to bottle caps? Why not to lumber? Why not to oil? Why gold in particular? And that's because that's just what we've always done. I'm not a big believer in the idea that we should peg our currency to a specific standard. Money has always been worth what people say it is, and no more. So I don't know that would solve the problem.
Which is shaky ground, right?
Yeah, and well, the thing is, like, fiat is fiat. People are going to assume that your dollar is worth what the dollar is worth. Canada, 10 years ago was higher than the U.S. dollar, and now we're back to about 75 cents, which is, typically we're around 75 to 80 cents.
Which instantly works well for me.
Exactly. If you want to come shopping up here, then you're legit. Me, on the other hand, if I want to go shopping in the States, well, I got to save up a long time before I do that. Yeah. But I'm just not a believer, and I know that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to convince you that because we are in an inflated currency environment and it's not based on anything, our whole economic system is going to collapse. Okay, how? China's going to call in our debts. First of all, China doesn't own enough debts to call in and collapse the U.S. economy. Then the question is, how much, what kind of debt does China own? The debt that's owned by foreign governments is bonds. Like, they buy T-bills, they buy bonds, they buy treasury notes, just like everybody else does that. And the majority of people who own U.S. bonds are Americans. Mm-hmm. So, and because your bond has a maturity date, as I explained in the last conversation that we have, you can't call in your bond early. You cash in your bond when the maturity date arrives. And if your bond is actually doing really well, to the point where if you were to try to buy a bond today, you wouldn't get as high of a coupon value, which is generally the case because interest rates are very low, then why on earth would you go ahead and cash it in? You want to keep getting that interest off of the bond. So when people try to conflate the way that governments do finances versus the way that households do finances, you run up into a lot of weirdness. Households can't print their own money. Households can't lend to foreign governments. Households cannot create their own productivity and invest in innovation and infrastructure. There's a lot of things that governments can do that individual people can't. So the idea that our economy is going to collapse because we're not pegged to something tangible and because we have high debts, I don't buy that.
Okay. Last question to wrap up here. So here's a question for you, and this is more the answer to this is probably a personal question. It may vary from one to the next, and it may be a value-based answer. And that is, should a couple combine their investments to grow it faster, or should they have their own investments, and why?
Yeah, don't put your investments together. Always keep your investments separate. Well, for your pension plans and for your 401k, for your RSP, you can't do that anyway. They have to be set up individually. For your tax-free savings accounts, for your IRAs, as far as I know, they have to be done individually. It's only for non-registered investments. So any kind of investment that doesn't involve the government stepping in and saying, oh, we're going to not charge you tax, or we're going to give you a tax deduction for investing in this. If it's a non-registered investment, just a plain old investment that the government does not get involved in, you can set it up as a joint investment. And I usually do not recommend that your investments be joint. Even if you have joint bank accounts, which, people are going to have joint bank accounts, that makes sense. Even if you had joint savings and everything else, your house isn't joint, I still recommend keeping your investment separate.
And the reason why is what? I like stirring it up.
No, I just want to caveat here, and I'm not a lawyer, but to the extent that I do understand, family law as far as the investments go, if you're married and you have investments together, or you have your own investments separate. If you split, you don't just get to hang on to your investments because you kept them in your name. They do form what's called part of the matrimonial property, and it's going to be split by the court regardless. But I usually recommend keeping this stuff separate because you might have your own risk tolerance, Sean, versus your wife's risk tolerance. I have my risk tolerance. I know what I'm comfortable investing in and what I'm not comfortable investing in, and my partner might not have the same ideas about that. And one of the quickest ways to turn a good relationship sour is to introduce differences on money into it. So even if you have joint savings and everything else, I usually do recommend that you have your investments separate because that's your comfort zone. That's your comfort level with a particular kind of investment. If you are more bullish than your wife is, or my girlfriend is more risky in her investments than I am, I don't want to have any more reasons to argue than already exist. You know what I mean?
There's already enough grief in life. You don't need any more.
Yeah, exactly. Like you don't want to put that in here. And the thing is, we don't even argue. Like my partner and I, we have not argued the entire time that we've been together. We've never had so much as raised voices. So why on earth would I want to go put that ticking time bomb? I don't want to go put this landmine into the relationship.
It's a spice of life.
Yeah, this goes sour, and now we got to fight about it. No way.
Prenuptials, prenups. Should you do it? Should you not do it? What's your thought?
Most of us don't have the kind of money that a prenuptial is necessary. I hate to say it, but fellas, if you're out there thinking that, for example, Janet Jackson divorced her. I think her husband was Saudi. I'm pretty sure he was, but I could be mistaken on this. So Janet Jackson is a multimillionaire in her own right. Janet Jackson could eat well for the rest of her life just on the movies that she's done. But she married a billionaire. And, they divorced after 5 years. They had a child together. And, a lot of guys out there, black dudes especially, were calling Janet Jackson a gold digger. When she's already worth more than you'll ever see in your life, my guy. You don't have to worry about, somebody trying to take you for what you have. For the most part, the differences in finances between partners is not so wide that a prenup is necessary. If you are, you're well established, you're working, you're successful, and you get involved with somebody who's just starting out in life, doesn't have their act together, doesn't have any assets of their own, probably has a bunch of debts, then sure, I could see why a prenuptial might be necessary. But if those are values that people tend to align on before they get into a relationship. So if you are successful, you're ambitious, you're out there getting it, but your partner is not, that probably isn't going to be a relationship that lasts. And I don't know that a prenuptial would really do anything on that front. It's usually more grief asking them to agree to it, and then the resentment from them actually agreeing to it and doing it. Is that really worth your relationship?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, the differences in, from my perspective, what I've seen of how people live and the incomes they earn, and how how a couple both contributes to the household income, is almost at par in most major cities in Canada, because the cost of living is so high. It's very difficult for a couple to survive on one person's income. It's virtually, I don't want to say impossible, but impossible is pretty close to the answer to that question.
Pretty tough, yeah.
It's pretty tough. Down here, it's very different. In the South, there's still a lot of very old Southern ways, even for young people, where oftentimes there's a couple. The husband usually ends up working. He has three choices. He can either, the wife usually has three choices. She can either work full time, work part-time, and stay home part-time, or stay home full-time. And those are still legitimate, very common options down here. It's not, right. No one frowns on you if you're at home full-time, right? It's a very common, I found it very interesting that I thought that only happened back in the 50s and 60s. I didn't realize people still did that, but down here it's not very unusual.
I'm aware that it's not just in the United States and the South. It happens a lot in rural communities where one partner might go to work and the other partner might stay home and take care of children and so forth. But then the other question you have to get into is, what is the value of domestic labor? What is the value of let's just go with a woman staying at home, for example. So if she stays home and she's, minding the children and keeping up the home and everything else, what is the value of her labor? So the idea that somebody can enter into a marriage, be forced to sign a prenuptial, to basically say the value of your labor right now, like I come into this relationship with what I have, and you come into this relationship with what you have. I have a lot, you have very little. I have high income earning potential. You have low income earning potential. It's going to stay that way because you plan on staying home and taking care of the kids. Then it's a matter of like, what kind of power dynamic are you establishing in that household? Because if things go wrong and things go sideways and you have to part ways, are you the kind of person that's okay saying, well, you know what, you leave and you take nothing with you? So that the labor that you put into making this relationship work, taking care of the kids, keeping up the home, doing the errands and everything else, my value on your labor is zero. So I tend to shy away from that.
Family law doesn't allow you to pull that card, because what typically happens is if you have two people in the couple, one has the earning potential, one is stay at home, and they divorce. What ends up happening is there's some equalization processes that happen. So they take a look at net worth of both those individuals. Of course, the one who makes the higher income has a higher net worth. So what ends up happening is, the way it works in Canada, is, at least the family law there, is that half of that individual's net worth, in terms of 50% of that net worth difference, goes to the partner to equalize them out. So she doesn't walk with nothing in her pocket. He walks with gold bars.
I'm not getting into what the family law court is going to say, and I completely understand where you're coming from, because you're right, there is the equalization process. What I'm saying though is that in most cases, and from what guys generally think of a prenuptial agreement to be, it values their time, labor, and net worth way higher than the partner's time, labor, and net worth. It puts the number on your net worth at what tangible or what quantifiable amount you have in your bank account is, and how much you're earning on a yearly basis, at the exact number that we can come up with. But then on the partner, that is, let's say it's the wife, it values it at almost nothing. I'm coming into this relationship with this amount. You're coming into it with that amount. And if we should part ways, we should leave as it was. And I'm not saying that I'm against prenuptial agreements. If there's a huge gulf in terms of net worth and income power, then you're obviously protecting yourself, and you're protecting your estate and protecting your family by having that kind of agreement, especially if it is, let's say, a second or third marriage. What I'm saying, though, is that a lot of us get into these really weird ideas about what a prenuptial agreement is supposed to be in our current relationships before you've even gotten married, just going into what's supposed to be a healthy marriage. But we've got these really weird and screwed up concepts about, whether we're going to get taken for a ride by this person. My view on that is, if you have to consider, and you're not like a multimillionaire, you're not like a high six-figure earner, you don't have like a ton of family assets that you're protecting. It's just you're building and she's building, you're doing it together. If it's entering your mind that you should have a prenuptial agreement, then my first thought is, okay, well, are you marrying the right person? Are you getting together with the right person?
Well, this is a whole other show. We can talk about divorce statistics and which partner tends to initiate divorce more frequently, and that's a whole other conversation that I won't start right now. But anyways, so with that going there, any final words that you want to give us before we wrap up here?
Yeah, it's as far as investments go, like, you could spend all year trying to find the right investment and the right strategy. And I find that the more research people do, they end up getting paralyzed. It's called paralysis by analysis, where you end up doing so much research and so much work trying to find the exact right investment that you end up doing nothing, which hurts you, because doing nothing is going to cost you more than doing something. So usually, my recommendation is just find an index fund that's cheap to invest in, and throw a small amount that you can put in consistently, whether it's $50 a month or $100 a month. Build yourself up to the point where you can actually start playing around with those funds. So you just get yourself in the front door on long-term savings. Don't try to buy the biggest and best investment. Don't try to find the stock that's going to blow up and make you a multimillionaire. Stick to the simple stuff. And if you get offered any sort of supplementary plan at work, especially if your employer is matching your contributions, like if your employer is matching you 100%, you're basically getting 100% return immediately just by picking an investment. Always go for those because the rates are cheaper for the fund fees, and you're going to be matched. Start somewhere. Just like start simple, take it easy, and as you get more comfortable and you get more experience, then you can start branching onto different kinds of investments. But the thing that I see people tripping themselves up on the most often is trying to become stock market experts before they really even have the money to save up. Right.
Yeah. I mean, keep it simple, stupid, right? Just the KISS principle, right?
Exactly.
One more question, actually.
Who makes the most money long-term investing?
Who's that?
Women. Because they keep it simple. They just plug away. It's not only for male investors, but also for male fund managers. They perform worse. Mm. Yeah, and it's a lot of it is this competitive nature and trying to chase performance and chase the best investment versus simply buying an investment and being consistent. Like consistency is the number one factor in how well your investment portfolio is going to do.
Right. Micro investments, real quick. It just popped in my mind. So I know that there are a lot of these new programs out there. There are mobile apps. One's called Stash. There's one that I've used called Acorn. The concept of it happens to be, you can literally invest $5 at a time, $5 a week, or $5, basically the cost of a cup of coffee. And what they typically do is they'll buy a fraction of a share, but they'll buy it, consistently over a period of time with very minimal, taking very little out of your disposable income to the point where you don't really notice it. And that, not saying that is your whole investment strategy, but I found personally for me, that's a great add-on or a great feature where, even though I may not, think about taking my tax return and sticking it into a retirement investment plan, I know that, every week, $5 or $10 or whatever else comes out and goes into an investment portfolio that I can then, choose to be aggressive, moderate, or very, very conservative. What are your thoughts about those? Those
are actually really good ideas. Any sort of strategy with investing where you don't even notice that you're putting money away is always a good one. I had it, for example, on my account with TD, that every transaction I did, $1 was going to go into a tax-free savings account. So and I had an unlimited account. So, every time I went to the grocery store, every time I went to a restaurant, every time I went to a movie, if I paid for parking or whatever the reason was that I used my debit card, every time that I used it, $1 would go into this tax-free savings account and it would go into investments that I chose. Because I didn't even notice it, it provided, the best return for me. And, any way that you can create micro investing, any way that you can take money away from yourself and put it away for the long term without actually harming yourself or, causing you to be short at the end of the month, I say go for it.
Right. I agree. I mean, I found that it was when I stumbled across it, it was still new. This company I went with called Acorn, and I did check to see, okay, what bank is underwriting your business, so this isn't someone's someone's basement, right? But yeah, anyways, I just thought I'd talk about that. And people who are interested in micro investing, there are several applications out there that you can load in your mobile app. The way mine works is your mobile phone. The way mine works is if I were to buy something for $1.88, what it will do is it will take 12 cents. It'll round it up to the next dollar, and that 12 cents is what it'll pull out of my account and stick into this investment. Of course, what they do is they, accumulate those minor little purchases until they got to about a $5 limit, and then they would purchase a micro investment with $5. But yeah, it's great. I look at it every day to see how it's growing. It grows very minimally, but it does grow. And of course, you get dividends, which are sometimes just 10, 12 cents, but it's money coming in as opposed to money going out. And
every little bit helps.
Every little bit helps. And the great thing about it is if I need to withdraw money, there's literally a little swipe. You just kind of swipe down to withdraw. You put in the value that you want, and 5 days later, it's sitting back in your account again. So it's not immediate enough that you'd kind of blow it saying, hey, I want to get this pair of Jordans, because you'd have to wait 5 days to get the money. But it's accessible enough that if you're going to come up short at the end of the month for something, or something big's coming up, you can still get access to that money. It isn't one of those things where it becomes a whole big production to get access to it.
Exactly.
All right. All right, Andre, I'm going to wrap it up here. So if you have any discussion topic ideas that you would like to see us tackle, please comment in this in the low bar here. We'll check the comments. Please like, share, and subscribe by clicking on the icon right here. If you enjoyed the show and want to see more, click here. Thanks again for joining Gentlemen United in the Man Cave.
Enjoyed the show? Like, share, and subscribe. And thanks for joining us in the Man Cave.